The name Plataea began to move quietly through the ranks of Greek commanders long before the soldiers ever marched there. It was spoken in strategic discussions and late-night councils, in whispered plans shared between generals who understood that the final confrontation could not take place in narrow passes or coastal choke points. Thermopylae had shown the Greeks something vital. Courage could slow Persia, but terrain could shape destiny. Plataea offered something new, a battleground where Greek hoplites could stand shoulder to shoulder in the open, where heavy armor and discipline might finally outweigh Persian numbers and mobility. It was not the kind of land that favored ambush or surprise. It was the kind of land where armies met face to face, where victory was earned through endurance, unity, and the raw power of locked shields. As word spread that this battle might become the reckoning so many had waited for, the atmosphere across Greece shifted. The grief that once suffocated the people began to turn into a quiet anticipation. Farmers who had lost their land to Persian raids sharpened old spears, hoping they would be called. Veterans who had hung up their shields found themselves cleaning the bronze once again. Even those who could not fight, elderly men, women, and children, prayed for the warriors who would march. They prayed not for safety, but for justice. Inside Sparta, preparations reached a fever pitch. Every message from the north spoke of Persian activity raiding villages, interrogating prisoners, attempting to intimidate Greek allies. Mardonius had not simply come to fight. He had come to break Greek spirit. He sent envoys to cities promising wealth, freedom, and security if they broke away from the alliance. Some cities wavered, a few even accepted his offers. But the majority understood a truth that echoed across the land. Persia wanted obedience disguised as peace. And Persia would never stop wanting it. For Pausanias, these shifting loyalties represented both a challenge and an opportunity. He knew that battling Persia required more than swords and shields, it required conviction. So he traveled personally to several allied states, speaking not as a conqueror or a king, but as a man who understood the price of freedom. He spoke of Thermopylae not as a tragic defeat, but as a promise. He reminded them that the 300 had held back an empire long enough to unite Greece. What they began, he would say in calm, steady tones, we must finish, and across Greece, people listened. In the training fields of Sparta, warriors assembled for what many felt would be the defining march of their lives. Older men adjusted the greaves on younger fighters, ensuring every piece of armor fit perfectly. Spears were inspected, shields reinforced, helmets polished until they gleamed like angry suns beneath the daylight. But beneath the preparations was something deeper, an emotion that bound the warriors into a single, unbreakable chain. They carried the weight of Thermopylae on their shoulders. Some had lost fathers in the past. Others had lost brothers. A few had lost friends whose final words still echoed in their minds. They marched not for glory. They marched for closure. In nearby regions, Athens recovered from its burning, gathering every able-bodied man to join the alliance. The Athenians carried wounds no less deep than the Spartans' wounds left by the sight of their city in flames, by the memories of temples collapsing under Persian axes. But unlike Sparta, Athens had something else rage sharpened by humiliation. They had watched their home burn from the safety of their ships, powerless to stop it. Now, they hungered for a moment when they could finally strike back. When the time came, the Greek army began to assemble. Not in rushed chaos, but in calm determination. Each city-state sent its contingent. Corinthians arrived with ranks of disciplined hoplites. Tegeans marched with spears held high. Even small towns sent what they could, sometimes a handful of men, sometimes dozens, each carrying the pride of their homeland with them. In total, tens of thousands of Greek soldiers began to gather, forming an army unlike anything the region had ever seen. Still, none carried a greater weight than the Spartans. They were the backbone, the iron center of the alliance, the reason many other cities had found the courage to join. Every Spartan in the ranks knew this. Every ally around them felt it. The sight of red cloaks flowing in the wind served as a reminder to friend and foe alike. The Greeks were done retreating. And Persia saw this gathering storm with growing concern. Mardonius watched the Greek mobilization carefully, sending scouts, spies, and riders to assess their strength. He had expected fear to divide Greece. Instead, fear had united it. But Mardonius was not a man who panicked. His strategy evolved with every report. He prepared the Persian forces with precision, knowing that if the Greeks gathered for a decisive battle, Persia had to strike before they could validate their strength. He strengthened his cavalry, reinforced his flanks, and made plans to devastate the Greek supply lines. He believed that if he could starve the Greeks of water, food, and morale, their unity would crumble again. Yet unity was no longer fragile. It was becoming something stronger each day. When the Greek army finally began its march toward Plataea, it did so under a sky that seemed to watch them with a solemn silence. The footsteps of thousands created a rhythmic thunder that rolled across valleys, stirring flocks of birds into flight. Travelers stepped aside in awe, watching men from dozens of cities move like a river of bronze and determination. But even among this sea of warriors, the Spartans stood out, their movements precise, their formation tight, their discipline unshakable. As they marched, they carried with them a memory that no one spoke aloud but everyone felt. The pass of Thermopylae, the mountain wind that had carried the screams of fallen friends, the isolation of those final hours when the 300 fought knowing their fate was sealed, and the final defiance of Leonidas, whose courage had become a myth before his body had cooled. Every step toward Plataea was a step toward answering that memory, a step toward balancing the scales. When the Greeks reached the region near Plataea, they chose their ground carefully. They needed terrain that could negate the advantage of Persian cavalry. They needed land where hoplites could form tight phalanxes without being harassed from the flanks. They found such terrain near the foothills uneven enough to disrupt a cavalry charge, but open enough for their heavy infantry to work as one. But Persia was already waiting. Mardonius had stationed his forces across the plains, confident and unshaken. His archers stood in massive ranks. His cavalry patrolled like swift shadows, testing Greek defenses and probing for weaknesses. His infantry millions in the empire, thousands on this field formed wave after wave of flexible, lightly armored troops ready to swarm the Greeks. But what concerned him most was not Greek strength, it was Greek discipline. For the first time in months, they had come not as scattered cities, but as a singular force with a singular purpose. And Pausanias understood this perfectly. Before any spear was thrown, before any shield met another, the air between the two armies filled with attention so thick it felt almost alive. The Greeks knew Persia was watching them, measuring them, waiting to see if they would break. But they would not break. Not now, not ever again. Their resolve had settled into something immovable. For Pausanias, that moment standing across from the same empire that had slaughtered his uncle at Thermopylae was a moment where history held its breath. He looked upon the Persian ranks and felt not fear, but clarity. This was the reckoning Greece had been pushed toward since the first Persian ship crossed the seas. This was the battle that would decide not simply land, not simply pride, but identity. It was no longer about survival. It was about legacy. And as the two armies watched one another across the open plains, both understood that the shadow of Thermopylae stretched all the way to Plataea. What began in a narrow pass would end here, in the open field where Greece would either rise or fall. Not the 300 who died at Thermopylae, their legend was already carved into eternity. This was a different echo, a different storm, one that erupted after the bodies of Leonidas and his men were left exposed under the sun, humiliated by the Persians as a broken warning to all of Greece. The world remembers the stand at Thermopylae, but what came after the fire that rose from that defeat is the part of the story most people never hear in full. Because Thermopylae was not the end, it was the beginning. When the news of Leonidas' death thundered through Sparta, the city did not weep. They did not mourn the way others mourn. Spartans did not accept grief without purpose. They absorbed it, sharpened it, forged it into something far more dangerous than despair. The mothers of the fallen did not tear their clothes or collapse in sorrow. They lifted their chins and said the words that held their society together like steel, "With your shield, or on it." And now their sons had come home on the shield, carried, not walking, but their sacrifice demanded repayment. Sparta did not forget betrayal. Sparta did not forgive humiliation. Sparta did not leave a debt unpaid. And Persia had created a debt greater than any in Greek memory. Across the city, beneath the stone colonnades and within the smoky interiors of training halls, the air changed. Young warriors paused mid-drill, their knuckles tightening around spear shafts. Veterans looked at one another with silent understanding. Even the old men, weathered by years, stared toward the mountains with a burning intensity, as if expecting Leonidas' ghost to rise at any moment and demand retribution. And retribution was already in motion. The ephors convened, the lawmakers of Sparta, the men whose decisions shaped the rhythm of the entire state. But this time their chamber shook with anger. Reports poured in from across Greece, Persian troops burning villages, enslaving survivors, trampling through sanctuaries, seizing grain and livestock, crushing rebellions with brutal efficiency. Their king Xerxes believed the Greeks were broken after Thermopylae, scattered, leaderless, trembling under the shadow of the greatest empire on earth. But Xerxes misunderstood something fundamental. He misunderstood the Spartans. Because the Spartans did not break. They bent like tempered iron, only to snap back harder. While Xerxes marched deeper into Greece, sending messages boasting of his victory, Sparta called upon every city-state willing to fight. Messengers ran across mountains and valleys carrying 3 words that hit the Greek world like a thunderclap. Thermopylae must be answered. It didn't matter if they were from rich cities like Corinth or humble villages perched on rocky cliffs. The call for vengeance was a net cast wide across the land. Among all of Greece, only a few had the iron to respond instantly, those cities whose pride, whose freedom, whose very identity would rather burn than kneel. And when these allies arrived in Sparta, they saw something they would never forget. Nearly 10,000 Spartan troops preparing not for defense, but for an unstoppable, disciplined march toward the final reckoning. The men who gathered were not raw recruits. These were seasoned warriors, survivors of campaigns stretching back decades. Men whose entire lives were built for a moment like this. Men who had trained since childhood in ways the world still struggles to comprehend. They were scarred, disciplined, unbreakable, and united by rage that simmered without a sound. And Sparta didn't just send soldiers, they sent a message. Every bronze cuirass was polished until it caught the sunlight like a blade. Every shield was inspected for cracks. Every spear was weighed, tested, balanced perfectly for thrusting through Persian armor. They marched in silence, but their silence was louder than any boasting Xerxes could shout from his golden throne. And when the allies saw the Spartans assembling line after line after line, shields overlapping, spears rising like a forest of revenge, they understood something. This wasn't a campaign. This was a verdict. The road to Plataea was not walked. It was judged. Because Persia had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They had stepped onto sacred ground, burned sacred temples, slaughtered sacred families. They had mocked the dead at Thermopylae. And no Spartan, not a single one, could live with that insult unanswered. The march began. It wasn't fast, it wasn't dramatic, but it was relentless. The kind of march where every step carries a promise. 12,000 men moved across the land, not as individuals but as a single living organism. Every footfall hit the soil with the weight of history. Farmers paused their work as the army passed. Children climbed rooftops just to witness it. Even the elderly stood straight as the bronze tide flowed by, because everyone knew what this meant. This was the army that would avenge Thermopylae. News spread faster than the soldiers could walk. Across valleys, across mountains, down coastal towns ravaged by Persian raids, people whispered, "The Spartans are coming," and for the first time since the invasion began, hope flickered across Greece. Meanwhile, far to the north, Persia sensed something shifting in the wind. What they thought was submission was actually the tightening of a fist. What they believed was fear was the silence of preparation. Xerxes, still holding the throne with confidence in his millions, expected to crush the Greeks with sheer numbers. But he did not understand a simple truth of war. Numbers don't win battles. Discipline wins. Cohesion wins. Purpose wins. And no army on earth possessed those 3 things with the intensity that Sparta did. Not after Thermopylae. Not after Leonidas. not after the humiliation of their king's body. The path to Plataea was long, but every mile carried the same heat, the heat of vengeance, the heat of a promise, the heat of a people who refused to disappear quietly from history. And now, as the Spartan-led coalition approached the plains of Plataea, their rage sharpened into focus. The land stretched open before them, wide, flat, perfect for the kind of battle that would not be decided by tricks or terrain. Perfect for a confrontation where two worlds would collide honestly, brutally, decisively. It was here, on this open ground, that the Spartans would shatter the illusion of Persian invincibility